Welcome to Just In Case, Case UK's podcast, where we choose to help build lives, not patients. Hello and welcome to Case UK, Just In Case podcast. Today we're going to be talking about burnout, and we've got the amazing Frankie Brooks with us. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. I just wanted to let you know that we're going to be talking about burnout from a number of different avenues, but primarily we're going to learn about what Frankie does and the stresses that come along with that, and we're going to learn then about how that can impact how a person feels with burnout. So, Frankie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Chrissie.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us. So, some of the questions that I've got for today, and I think that everyone's going to be really interested primarily to find out what it is that you do. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do for a living?
As you said, Frankie Francis to my mother, and I am a spinal surgeon by training, so I work in the NHS in Cardiff and Vale. I also have a couple of other roles within the NHS, so I'm Assistant Clinical Director for the South Wales Spinal Network. So I've been a spinal consultant since 2017. And then I made the big move from Newport to Cardiff in 2020, just before COVID hit. So I've now been in my role in Cardiff for 5 years.
And I'm really interested to hear about the work that you do. And I'm hoping that your mum will be listening to this, so I can call you Francis if you want for the rest of the podcast.
Frankie's fine.
So what is it like to be a spinal surgeon? What's a typical day like for you?
Days vary, obviously. So some days we are more clinical based and we see patients being referred with problems affecting the spine and spinal cord. So I deal with mostly adult patients at the moment, and I treat what we term degenerative disorders. So that could be a curvature that's come on as someone has aged. It could be as a result of deformity, as a result of trauma. I also deal with people who have compression of the nerves in the neck and legs commonly, but also in the thoracic spine. And I also deal with people who have compression of the spinal cord. Every day is varied, which is, I guess, one of the good aspects of spinal surgery in that you don't know what you're going to see and you don't know what you're going to get. And then I have, at the moment, operating lists once a fortnight, which is, as a surgeon, is the area of medicine that I enjoy the most, being in theatre, operating and seeing the beauty of the human body in a very privileged and fortunate way, in that, I see the parts of people that nobody else quite often will see. And I guess the power of that, a while back, my son, who is 10, asked me what I'd been doing that day, and I'd done an operation on someone who had a spinal cord injury some years back, and they developed a condition called Charcot spine, where essentially as a result of an injury, they then go on and start destroying the bone, and they had instability in the spine, so they could essentially separate their spine in two. So that was in the thoracic spine. So I spent with one of my colleagues quite a long time operating, and I was staring at his heart and his lung for part of the day because we went through the chest to remove the spine. So that's when you realise, the sort of joy and awe that gave my son hearing that had been in someone's chest that day. It's very few people who get to have that privilege, and it is a privilege, but with any privilege comes pressures as well.
Absolutely. And that sounds amazing, but really scary as well.
I mean, being a surgeon, you carry responsibility. We do things that kind of go against the Hippocratic Oath in terms of the common understanding of it is first do no harm. And as a surgeon, you automatically are doing harm because you're cutting into someone's body. So there is a burden of responsibility that comes with that. And when it goes wrong, which unfortunately it can do from time to time, it's not a pleasant place to be at that time.
Yes, and I think that it's the difficult side to surgery, isn't it? And ultimately, the work that you're doing, it's highly pressurized. There's a lot more involved than a lot of us will necessarily think about. And I know that when it comes to surgery, I have my ways of thinking about it, but the way that you've put it, I think it's really eloquent, and I think it puts it in a way that has made me think.
We are privileged, and I think that's something I try and instill in the junior doctors that come through our department, is that getting to operate isn't a right, and or is a right, but with rights, the old adage, with rights come responsibilities, and the responsibility is first off to understand the disease, understand the risks of what you're putting at people at by proposing a certain course of action. Also, provide that level of care that you'd want to provide to your family and relatives, if they were in that circumstance, or that you'd want them to have. So it does come with the pressures, and those pressures at times can be quite significant, and sometimes I think most of us would admit that sometimes those pressures can get a bit above us, and we possibly don't perform as well as we'd like to. And that, with that, I always go back to the fact that we term it a medical practice, and with anything practicing, you do have to have that level of stress where you are under pressure that brings out that best performance. But if you can't control that stress, you end up potentially in that area of burnout.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, isn't it? There is a certain amount of pressure that we have, and I think within working life, within the role that you do especially, I think there is a certain amount of pressure that comes with that, and some of that can actually be motivating, can't it? But I think that, like you said, when it adds to burnout, and it can impact how stressed that you feel. And I think that when it comes to stress, when it comes to burnout, it can impact your work-life balance. Would you say that being busy with the work that you do as a spinal surgeon, what's your work-life balance like?
I'd say I've got a good work-life balance, but my wife would probably tell me that I work too hard. I think the thing that really changed for me with work-life balance was that I saw an interview with Simon Sinek, and he was talking about work-life harmony rather than work-life balance, because obviously there will be times in everyone's life where pressures of work are mounting, and work has to be that sort of number one priority. And then there are other times when family members are unwell, or you've got to help your family, and that can knock on to that, or you've got to prioritize your own self-care, so you sort of ease off the gas, as it were, in terms of work. And I think that's a really good I found that a really useful way of thinking of things in terms of work-life harmony rather than work-life balance. And at times I know that my work-life harmony is out of kilter, and I have to have a reflection on what am I doing, what's serving me, what's helping me be the best spinal surgeon I can, but also what's helping me be the best husband and best father, and equally looking after my own self, so that I'm there to hopefully be a granddad one day, and things. And that's something I've probably not hand on my heart recently. I've probably been out of kilter a bit, working a bit too much and not looking after myself enough. So that's something that I am sort of trying to change and focus on more recently, is just getting a bit healthier.
And I think I really like the point when it comes to the work-life balance and thinking about it as a harmony, because it should be a harmony, and sometimes it will look different depending on what we've got going on and what we choose to do as well. Because I think sometimes in life there are opportunities that we choose to take because we want to, and to others that balance might not look the way that they might want, but it looks the way that we want, and that's important too. So, on the note of talking about the work-life harmony and talking about stresses, I think it's really important to recognize when we're not looking after ourselves as well as we could be. And I think that a lot of us are guilty of that, aren't we?
Oh, massively. And I think, social media has good points and bad points. And one of the bad points of social media is that, you can end up going down some Instagram rabbit hole and suddenly you've sat there on your phone for an hour when you should have been doing something else in terms of going to the gym, exercising, just getting out, enjoying the Welsh countryside, or going to bed. And I think that's the thing that I've recently realised is, actually I need a good number of hours sleep every night, and my sleep, you can work till 12 o'clock one night, but you've got to pay that back, and at some point, or fill that tank up. Otherwise, you end up running on empty, and that doesn't help anyone. I know when I get tired and get stressed, I get a bit snappier with people, whether that's in theatre or at home, and then you just sort of catch yourself going, actually, that's not who I want to be. You need to have that flexibility to have a degree of insight into when things aren't working the way you'd like them to.
I agree. I think that it can be something that we need to spend time reflecting on, and we need to think about our circumstances and what our needs are. And I think that all of the points that you've raised, they're really important, aren't they? And we don't always think about what we need to do for ourselves. And to pick up on the point of sleep, for example, we don't always think that we're not feeling great because we haven't had enough sleep until we take a bit of time to reflect on that. And actually, there are many factors that can influence stress, that can influence burnout. And when it comes to social media, I completely agree. And a friend of mine calls it doom scrolling, where it feels
Yep.
like doom, but she can't stop herself doing it. And I think that it really defines it, doesn't it? Because we can end up going down that rabbit hole of social media. There's many other things that we might do that as well because we procrastinate and put off our own self-care and our own well-being for varying other things that we think are helping. So what other things would you say would help to combat burnout in particular?
First off, is understanding burnout is a response to that sort of occupational stress, but also can be a response to stresses elsewhere. So first thing is to try and make it to the point that I saw a nice diagram on a talk earlier today, which showed sort of almost like a cliff edge, and you want to be operating in that area of stress. And when I say operating, I don't mean from a surgical point of view, but you do need that degree of stress to heighten your awareness. Stress in itself is not a bad thing, but it's when those stresses are constant and all consuming. We know from several studies that the rate of burnout amongst healthcare professionals has gone up recently. Obviously, the COVID pandemic has been a big factor to that, and the stresses that's brought. But I think it's worth thinking of other aspects as well. So the economic climate that the UK is in at the moment with the cost of living crisis, I think that will have been contributing because people will feel they need to earn a certain level of income to provide for the family, and there's those stresses. And then in the UK, we have a high litigation rate in healthcare, and a lot of people are surprised that the data that we saw recently was that we are second in the world behind Israel for the amount of litigation per head of population. So we're actually more litigious than our colleagues across the pond, which is often, a surprise to people. So there's lots of factors that contribute to those stresses, and quite often I think they feed into bad habits that we can have. So, drinking too much, smoking, eating too much, not sleeping enough. And we see a lot of those behaviours amongst surgeons. We know the rate of burnout. There's this paper that looked at lots of different papers in 2021, and that That sort of highlighted that amongst surgeons that the rate of burnout is around a third of surgeons are burning out. That obviously has a big impact on the healthcare service, that you've got people who are coming to work who have an apathy towards the work that they're doing, potentially don't want to be there, equally have a sort of crisis of confidence, so have a degree of imposter syndrome. And that fear then it sort of fuels the fire of the burnout that keeps them up at night. So they're exhausted, they're constantly on edge, and they're starting to doubt their ability despite their training. That is becoming a bigger problem in the UK health service in terms of gaps in rotas that we've got in the NHS at the moment. I think also we are getting a lot bigger picture of what burnout is, and that's a really important conversation that has been had around general mental health. And medicine's not the only area that we see burnout in. We see it in entrepreneurs, we see it in the third sector and care sectors as well. So it isn't just a medical issue, but it was first looked at by the WHO in medicine and was accepted to be a response to chronic occupational stress.
And I think there's some really, really key points and some very interesting things that you've pointed out there as well. And I think that in relation to burnout in particular, there is a lot of research, but I think that when it comes to the practice that we put into place in order to support ourselves and to support people in the workplace, to support numerous roles, and as you said, it's not just limited to healthcare, it's not just limited to surgeons. There are a lot of people that experience burnout, and there are a lot of people that struggle with it. And I guess in my mind, to put that simply in relation to burnout, it's feeling as though our usefulness has come to an end. And I think that it's like a match that's been struck, isn't it? It feels as though that usefulness is gone and that the purpose that we were trying to serve has come to an end. And I think it can leave us feeling apathetic, as you said earlier. It can leave us feeling underwhelmed, overwhelmed. It can leave us feeling as though there are no emotions left. And that can be a really scary place to be, especially in a role where what you do is very caring and you do it because you want to provide support and provide help for other people. And it's the same in a lot of healthcare roles and a lot of roles that we do. And then to experience burnout, and burnout can happen to absolutely anyone. Anyone can get to that point where they feel so overwhelmed with everything that they've got going on that they feel as though they've got nothing left to give. The next job, the next piece of work that gets asked of them is going to be that one step too far. And then we feel as though we'll have nothing else left. And I think that if we were able to give ourselves some tips about how we could provide ourselves with some support. So what would you say would be really helpful to help manage some of those symptoms and some of that burnout?
From a surgical perspective, I think one of the things that as a community and sort of speak about surgeons throughout, not just spinal surgeons, but I think we're very poor at mentoring people, and I think mentoring is really vital. I've said this openly to a lot of people. When I became a consultant in 2017, I found it the most lonely place that I had ever been as a doctor. You know, hospital environment, you've got a team of people that you're part of. And I think this is probably true for all leadership roles where you're the decision maker, that you feel quite lonely because there's no one that you can turn to and go, oh, what would you do? There is, but you don't necessarily feel that. And I think having a mentor and bringing that sort of mentor practice really fully into a hospital would be really great. I also am a big advocate of coaching. I've had coaches, in particular, just after COVID, I kind of was at that point where I realised I was a bit burnt out, and so I went and had a non-medic coach me, and I found that was really useful because there's so many aspects that I was trying to do in my career as a doctor, within the NHS and outside of the NHS, and used the analogy of sort of climbing up a mountain with a rucksack on your back, and you've got all these objects in the back, and they're sort of jabbing you in the back. And he said what you need to do is, it sounds a very simple analogy, sit down and work out what things that you're carrying in your sort of backpack aren't serving you. And don't be afraid to say, you know what, that's not the person I want to be. That doesn't align with my values. I think we get quite complacent, or not, maybe complacent's the wrong word. I think one of the things that I've always been is quite open about any complication that I've had. Yeah, I know I've spoken to surgeons who allege to have never had a single complication, and that unfortunately, I'd wish that was the case, that most of us never had any complication. But unfortunately, complications are part of a surgical practice, and I think there's a degree within the NHS that actually and within healthcare that failing is a bad thing, and you shouldn't fail. And obviously, when you're talking about people's lives and lifestyles, then yes, failing is a terrible thing when you can't get rid of someone's pain or someone dies. And I'm not saying that we should advocate for that, but medicine is practiced in this way that puts an abnormal pressure on us to be perfect 100% of the time. And human nature is that we can't be perfect 100% of the time. And I think that then when you have those complications, you kind of feel like you're a pariah or a leper amongst the community, and you think nobody else has ever had that complication, and nobody else has ever had that happen to them. And as a community, I think we need to be a bit more open about, actually, we do have our failings. Failings are not a bad thing. You actually, in every other industry, you learn far quicker from your failings than you do from your successes, because you learn what you did wrong and how to rectify that. There are a few of the things that I think would be really useful. The last one is probably a very difficult thing to allow, but I think one of the cultures in the NHS is, you say it's a no blame culture, but I think anyone who works in the NHS would advocate that they don't feel that is a true representation.
I think it must be really difficult as well. And as someone that doesn't work in the NHS, as you know, I work in mental health. And I think that one of the things that I see quite often, because people will put a lot of blame on themselves, even if they're not to blame. And this isn't about placing blame anyway here, but I think sometimes it's a really lonely and a very difficult place to be, especially if the support that is needed isn't always there, and not necessarily because the support isn't available, but I think sometimes when people put blame on themselves, they don't always feel as though they should be accessing support, because they don't feel as though they're worthy of that support, even though they absolutely are. And as you said, perfection 100% of the time is something that is not going to be an achievable outcome for anyone. And as much as you go into it not doing any harm, it's, like you said, it's a really difficult area, isn't it? Because you don't want anybody to be hurt, and you don't want harm to come to anyone. And sometimes things that happen can be completely out of the control of the person who's involved, and then what they feel afterwards, it can be really difficult. And the headspace within that can be an awful place to be, I can imagine. And I think that what you said about mentoring and coaching, I think having that space to be able to go, actually, I'm feeling really bad about this, and I'm feeling really awful, and I'm not sure, I just want to talk it through, could be something that is absolutely needed, just to pick apart what's happened, to make sense of things, in order to try and create some sense of peace or some sense of balance with it. I don't know if you agree with that. I don't know what your thoughts are.
What you said, Chrissie, is really eloquent in terms of, if you are struggling with your job in the NHS, the only people to go and talk to are your superiors or your colleagues. And there is a degree, I think, amongst a lot of the healthcare staff that I know, that actually they don't want to admit that they're struggling, or because they see that as a failure or a weakness. And especially in surgery's come a long way from the sort of traditional viewpoint of it being a toxic masculinity culture. And some of the best surgeons, and we've seen this recently with complications in surgery, that female surgeons generally get lower complication rates, and we're not quite sure why that is, but they are obviously doing very well, and I think we need to look into that sort of area, and bring a bit of compassion towards the staff. I think the NHS is a fantastically compassionate organisation for its patients when they are being treated, but I don't necessarily think the staff in the NHS are afforded the same. And I think that is something that we can only change by having an open and honest dialogue, and by looking at ways to improve it. Everything at the moment, due to the horrendous backlog that we've got from COVID, is all target driven. And one of the issues that I think is forgotten about when you're chasing targets and trying to bring everything under control is that your staff can only work so many hours a day. If you're asking them constantly to do a bit more, you lose that work-life harmony that we were talking about earlier. That chronic workload is adding extra stress on top of all the stress already. One of my gripes is that, some of the things that would reduce the stress in my job, we're not afforded that because it costs money and they don't want to spend. There's a balance sheet that has to be balanced at the end of the financial year, so there's always a reluctance to spend large amounts of money on stuff, which I completely get. I don't have to have the pressure of balancing that, but if that meant that your surgeons are less stressed, then that can only benefit you in the longer term in terms of less likely to go off with stress-induced illnesses. I saw today that something like 80% of the illnesses treated by the NHS have stress as a cause for it. So that chronic stress is a massive issue. And if there are ways to reduce that, I think you then benefit from that. And I think the mentoring coaching is one aspect. And a while back I spoke to a couple of NHS trusts about, because during COVID I did some coaching qualifications, and I wanted to go in and help coach doctors around any issues that they were having, because I felt that was a good way of giving back to the medical community. And I was advised that one organisation said they don't do coaching for doctors. I think that's a tragedy that we're not spending that money on and looking into staff wellbeing in that way.
It's difficult, isn't it, in caring roles, because I think I said this earlier, we don't always consider looking after ourselves first. And I think there's lots of that in instances in caring, because we're caring for other people. And then it's reminding yourself you need somebody else almost to tell you to care for yourself as well, because you are important. All of us as individuals have to make sure that we provide ourselves with the opportunity to look after ourselves and make ourselves our primary focus of well-being. And that doesn't mean that we have to spend less time focusing on other people, because you are important as an individual. You're so incredibly important. It goes back to the point you made as well about in all different roles, and I think probably in the finance role there's a lot of stresses and a lot of people feeling very overwhelmed as well. And I know that you've said you can see the difficulties that comes with, and I know for us looking in on the work that you do, I can absolutely see where some of those difficulties and those stresses come from. And I think that's why it's so important that we're having this conversation, because it's helping us to see that actually we need to think about things in a way that helps us look at what we can actually do to make things better and to help people feel less of those symptoms of burnout. On that note, what would you say if somebody was struggling with burnout or experiencing burnout? what would you say those recognizable symptoms are? What are the early signs? What are the things that we might look at and think that person is starting to show signs of burnout?
So I think the symptoms can be quite broad to look at. So they quite often sort of report a loss of enthusiasm for the work or emotional exhaustion. They become quite depersonalised, unempathetic, which obviously as a medic or a healthcare worker is vitally important that you've got that ability to empathise with people. Then you get the aspect of, in terms of the self-doubt and the sort of belief that they're not good enough, that they don't have the competencies, the imposter syndrome. And then I think it's something that is quite difficult to pick up the subtle signs for. I think it's something that when you look back, you go, oh shit, I was burnt out at that point. I can remember going in and just not enjoying work. And I'm privileged. I enjoy my job, I'd say 90% of the time. There are 10% of the time where I don't, but it's not a continuous thing. I think being a dad with two young kids, with one who doesn't overly sleep that well, I feel quite tired at times, but then is that not just normal to being a father? There's a degree that there isn't it's not like some of the conditions that we treat where you can say, oh, I've developed pain down my arm, and you go, oh yeah, you've prolapsed the disc, or you've got a bit of neck pain or back pain. That you can have that sort of predominal pre-diagnostic. It's kind of something that you probably have to sit back and reflect on and look back. But you made a really good point, I think, Chrissie, in terms of health in general. And there's lots of people. I think the Huberman podcast does a good job of sort of helping people understand the ways of making sure that they are as fit as they can be. But health is wealth, and without being healthy, you can't get so many things in life but if you are healthy, you've got so many opportunities to do stuff. And I think that's something that quite often is maybe missed by a lot of people. It's maybe overthought within the healthcare profession, that actually if you're not looking after yourself, my skills as a spinal surgeon, my ability to help people disappears if I can't operate. And therefore, keeping myself healthy, being able to impact the care of the people who I look after, hopefully for the better. That's great wealth that I bring from that, and I think that's a really important point. It doesn't matter what you're doing, you still need to look after yourself.
Absolutely. Self-care is so important. We did a podcast with Sandy Cooper a few months ago, and we talked about self-care and how important self-care is to us. And it really is. It's not selfish, as some people will worry that they're doing things for themselves, but it's actually really key to look after ourselves because, as you said, there are varying signs that we might experience burnout. Sometimes people don't always notice them. And I think that in relation to burnout, when I've delivered courses, when I've talked to people about burnout, sometimes I describe it as 12 flames. And there are 12 flames to burnout, and we don't tend to notice them until it gets to the flames that are much hotter, they burn brighter, because it tends to be a much more noticeable change in behavior. But it starts with starting to pull back from things that we enjoy doing. And it might be something it's really subtle, we don't notice it. There might be certain subtle changes in our behavior. And then there can be a whole spectrum. And sometimes we don't notice that it's becoming more significant because it's happening over a period of time. And like you said, we can sometimes look back and think, actually, I wasn't really coping very well. And I think that one of the really big signs for me was the lack of joy and doing things that I know that are things that I've really enjoyed doing. They're things that I'm passionate about, but not feeling the joy in them because of being so close to feeling so burned out. And I think that we are all very different and we all experience things in a different way. But that was one of the signs for me that was very obvious.
I think your point there, we are all different, and what stresses I might find as too much and lead me to burnout might not push someone else over, but equally someone else's stress levels might, I might not quite understand that. And I think that's the important thing with this is that there isn't, there's not a magic test that you can do, that comes back, in medicine we like things that we can measure, and there isn't really you can say, oh, you're 20% burnt out today and tomorrow you're 40%, or it is one of those things that sneaks up on you and you then sit back and go, oh, I'm not enjoying this, I'm not enjoying my job, I'm not enjoying things that I know. Before we went live, we were talking about live music, and say maybe avoiding going into those circumstances, or avoiding things that you'd like to do normally. And it's that sort of global overview that you need to have. And I like your analogy about the 12 flames, and it's maybe not until you're down to your last couple of flames when you go, oh, I'm not in a good place now.
Yeah. Just to go into your point about live music is absolutely a happy place for me. And I think that everyone around me would know that if I say no to a gig or no to going to live music, they'll know there's something very wrong, because I absolutely adore going to live music, many of them. So, what would you say would be, and thank you so much for all of the points that you've raised, because I think this is so key, isn't it? And it's really important to understand that there is no one size fits all when it comes to how we feel and how we might experience things like stress and burnout. And stress can bring out the worst in us. Going back to one of the very first points you made about sometimes feeling a bit snappy, and that can come out in ways that we might not want it to, and it can absolutely bring out the worst in us. So, on that note, what would you say is a way to create your own balance or your own sense of happiness? What would you do?
I think one of the best pieces of advice I got when I was a junior doctor from a consultant was always take your annual leave. You need to get away from that pressure environment and take it in regular aspects. So don't try and take it all at one time. So make sure you've got breaks from work, from that stress environment. I think it's also important to have a social aspect. So one of the things that I've got into recently is playing touch rugby. I am not blessed with a turn of pace. It doesn't come naturally to me, but it's going out, it's having a laugh with a group of middle-aged men, and then going for the pint afterwards and having that time with nobody's talking. There are a few medics who do it, but most of them are non-medics, and I think that can equally be quite a good thing to have that break from medicine. I think in medicine, a lot of my friends are medics. I don't have many non-medic friends, and I think that's probably not a healthy thing in terms of if you out and about, you potentially end up always talking shop. And I also think one of the things that I've tried to do recently, which can be a challenge, but get out on so I can't really do it when I'm operating, but when I'm in clinic all day, I work in the Heath Hospital, so we've got the Heath Park next door to it, which is quite a nice little park. So I try and get out for, a little walk, get outside, get a break, change the environment. I think those are just little tips that I find helpful. Not everybody might find those helpful, but I think having ways of, things that you enjoy, having that support network that you can count on, that's not necessarily full of people who do the same, but equally getting out and enjoying nature as well.
Those 5 ways to wellbeing, isn't it? And it's about connection. It's about engaging with others. It's about doing what we want to do as well, isn't it? And I think going out into nature, taking walks, doing things that just promote a sense of happiness, whatever that is for each of us as individuals, it's really important. Our own sense of harmony.
There's that speech, I don't know where Matthew McConaughey gave it, but one of the biggest, and that's where I find social media can be a really bad thing, is that you end up comparing yourself or your life to what someone's posted about on Instagram or TikTok, or and comparison is the thief of joy. So if you start going around comparing yourself, you'll always find someone who's got more money, bigger house, fancier car, those sort of materialistic things. And quite often, from a social media point of view, we're led to believe that equals happiness. And I think it's important to realise that, as you said, happiness is what, whatever you make it. For me, it's coming home, getting time to take my kids swimming, spending time watching my son playing his sports, or watching my daughter, or do a dancing and also playing netball. So that's what gives me the joy and contentment, and that I go, you know what, life is good. And I think it's important to cherish those little things.
Absolutely.
That help realise that actually, you can reduce the stress, deal with those stressful days, and enjoy those moments more.
And it's in the small things sometimes. And before I came here to talk to you, I took my little girl to football, and it's an absolutely gloriously warm evening. So they had a huge water fight after football, and it was just so much fun to see everyone just really enjoying themselves. And it's just wonderful, isn't it, to have key moments like that in life, and whatever they look like for us.
On Monday, I had parents' evening, and my kids did really well, but my daughter struggled with what she calls lexia. So she got diagnosed with dyslexia earlier this year, and the joy was getting the feedback from the teacher about how well she's done with her reading and writing, and in fact that she's scoring so high on the standard test that we do in Wales. And I think that gives you so much joy and satisfaction, that seeing that. And she's equally a very gifted netballer at the start of her career, and it's really fun to go and watch her and see the enjoyment that she gets from that. And like you're saying, just the simple things, like we're blessed to have a reasonable sized garden, and it's nothing more. My kids love to have a water fight, and it's great fun watching them, horse around together.
Not so great when we get drenched.
So
That's what happened to me before I came out from all of the children, but it was fun.
Wim Hof would tell you that cold water therapy cures everything.
Got Byron in the office who absolutely loves cold water therapy. So he did a podcast with us in the previous one along with John, and it was amazing to talk to him. But he really enjoys a bit of cold water therapy. Have to check out one of our videos that we've got online, because he's got a recorded video of him in one of his cold water therapy sessions.
Rather him than me. I'm a warm shower guy all the time. I've tried the cold water, and it's not for me.
But that's it, isn't it? It's about finding the things that we enjoy, and there's so many different things that we can try, and it's trial and error sometimes to find what we will find enjoyable for us as individuals. And
Absolutely.
thank you so much for speaking with us today. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners?
The only thing I'd say at the end, for anyone who is feeling that they are burnt out, there are supports out there. It's not something to be fearful of. It's not something that you should be ashamed of. The first port of call is to go and have a chat with someone, and any problem like that, I think the first stage is realising that there is a problem. And once you do that, then that's the first hurdle cleared.
Absolutely. And if anyone is listening and you think that you're not quite sure, or you're noticing some early signs from what we've talked about, then by all means access some support. There are loads of excellent resources. Have a look in the chat bar at the bottom and have a look at some of the links that we'll post around burnout and places that you can get support. Check out the website as well, because we've got some amazing resources that you can have a look at. And if you need to talk to somebody, have a look at what's available and get in contact with us. So thank you, Frankie, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise, Chrissie, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Case UK's podcast, Just In Case. Please make sure that you subscribe to this podcast in your preferred podcast app. That way you'll never miss a future episode. And be sure to follow us on social media. Check out our website, www.case-uk.co.uk. And don't forget, we're here for you just in case.
Blue sky, sweet and fresh water.